So I'm Jeanette Wright, I'm the State Librarian, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to the Untold Stories Forum. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal people and the Yagara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of the State Library on Kurilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we like to continue that tradition every time we invite people here to the State Library. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome our keynote speaker, renowned actor, writer and director, Leah Purcell, who's sitting here. Our panel speakers, author Mary Rose McColl, our SLQ staff members Naomi Takafanga and Linda Phillips, who will also be speaking, Councillor George Seymour of the Fraser Coast, and Mayor Cliff Harrigan of Wudjil Council, who's one of our speakers, representatives from collecting organisations from all over Queensland and beyond, I believe, and everyone who believes in the value of telling and recording our stories. Today we will explore the importance of stories to us and our wider communities, to learn ways of sharing stories and the value of keeping our stories where they can be kept and easily accessed by future generations. This uncovering of untold stories provides a richer perspective, an alternative history, an outlook that is different from our own established view. And as libraries and cultural institutions, we can reflect the people and events that don't always make the front page. Our histories are so much more than what is captured in official sources, and the generations to come will learn from the collected experience of what has gone before. From the largest organisation to the smallest community group to interested individuals, we all have a role to play in capturing and preserving this wide range of histories. So stories are a way of making knowledge and facts come alive, to give them meaning, make them memorable, and particularly the oral tradition, the stories that we tell to one another. And these stories, as well as what we call the documentary heritage, the stories and the knowledge that's written down in our papers and documents from previous generations. And traditionally, that's what the State Library has collected. And over the years, we've learned that we need to be collecting a much more comprehensive picture of the story of Queensland. And I know from having worked in business that not only do individuals, families and communities have stories, but businesses have stories as well. And so if you're here and you haven't visited the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame, you might like to go and have a look at that in perhaps over the lunch break or something, and have a look at some of the stories that we have about some of the famous businesses in Queensland, which includes stories of individuals and families. So our Queensland stories can come from anyone and anywhere, and it's the challenge of everyone in this room to uncover, record and share those stories. This is also your opportunity to reflect on the important role that public libraries and local history organisations play in this whole web of collecting. Here at the State Library, we've begun to map our digital library future and to recognise the need for supporting a distributed collection for Queensland so that we don't expect it all to be stored here. What we want to do is work with many organisations who already have collections, some original materials, some local histories, some just contacts with community leaders or people in the community who have a story to tell. We want to work with you and support your organisations in capturing those stories, but also help provide sometimes the technology and the expertise to develop a preservation pathway so the stories are there for generations to come. And we know that even working with a small amount of oral history we have on recorded on tape here in the library, that's a big challenge. We have to work out how we convert that content to something that can be easily retrieved, but not only how do we convert it to a digital form so that we can make it available for people who don't come into the State Library building here, but also how do we make sure it's accessible in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. If you just think about the content that you've got in your own family, what about that shoebox of photographs and the bottom drawer with old tapes and VCR tapes and things that people have collected some precious moments in their family stories? And how do we make sure that we convert those stories into something that can be available and accessible in years to come? And that's something where the size and the scale of the State Library of Queensland can help you develop the skills and the expertise and sometimes the shared technology to capture and preserve that content, and then not necessarily have it stored here, but just so that it's accessible and discoverable for other people who don't necessarily come here, and that you can retain rights to that content in your organisations. So we all have a story to tell, and if we had a lot of time, I'd tell you mine, but perhaps over a coffee I'm happy to do that. But storytelling is how we make knowledge come alive. And libraries, as I said, have a role to play in this, but so do the personal stories, and libraries can now support the capture and preservation of these personal stories. And so today we have an exciting array of storytelling techniques and processes, and we have a group of speakers with experience in this space, and particularly when we're looking at the stories from Indigenous peoples in Queensland. So I'm going to hand over to Peter Browning. Peter will be the MC for the day's session. Peter is the Community Development Manager for the Hornery Institute, and he also spent some time here at the State Library, so he too will have a story. And what I'd like to do is hand over to Peter, and he can then introduce the speakers as we go. And I hope that many of you will be able to stay around for the end of the day, because at 5:30 we've asked Cliff Harrigan and his band, the Black Image Band, to play for us in the cafe downstairs. And we think this will be a wonderful way to draw attention to the fact that in a month or so we will have special exhibitions here at the State Library, one of them called Live Queensland's Band Culture, which is the history of band culture and music in Queensland since the late 19th century, right up through the 1970s and 80s when Queensland bands hit it big time elsewhere. And it also will draw attention to the fact that we'll have a special exhibition called Deadly Brothers in our Kurral Dargan space. So Cliff's band will be an opportunity for us to experience a bit of the Deadly Brothers music. So on that note, I'll hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Jeanette. As Jeanette said, my name's Peter Browning. I work for an organisation called the Hornery Institute, and yes, part of my long story so far is that I was part of one of the many hundreds of people who were part of bringing this building together, so it's always really lovely to come back here and spend some time here. My role today is to be keeping the journey moving, keeping the narrative together and helping the day's story form. And with that in mind, first of all, I want to welcome you all here and giving up your time today to come along and bring your particular stories to this event. A bit of housekeeping first. The first thing is that this whole session is going to be recorded, and it'll be available on after the event. It'll be available on the SLQ website. So if you want to go back and share the whole process with other members of staff and your networks, you're going to be able to do so. And also, for those who tweet, put your hands up if you're a tweeter. Oh, we got a few. If you're a person who tweets, you can actually tweet during the forum, and you can use the little hashtag there. So fear of this turning into one of those Tony Jones sessions, but you can actually use that hashtag there, where I find myself watching the tweets more than I do listening to the speakers. For those who don't know, or you haven't already found it, the toilets are outside, directly opposite. You go out of these doors and they're directly opposite. Directly opposite the auditorium. We're going to also be, I think people know where morning tea is going to be, but I'll explain that to you when we get there again. Okay, my first great pleasure is to introduce Leah Purcell. And it's nice that we've actually had a little bit of time to sit down and talk, and already found stories that we've shared in common over the last, and experiences we've got in common over the last 2 years. I'm sure all of you already know Leah. Leah's is an incredibly well-known Australian actor, director, writer and singer. She comes from a long line of vaudevillians and has come a long way from the high school musicals and family gatherings where she learnt her trade. Her first professional break was in a role of Bran Nue Dae, which toured Australia and has led to roles in television programs and film. Leah also conceived and co-wrote semi-autobiographical play Box the Pony, which has been performed nationally and internationally to great acclaim, and which earned Leah the Helpman Award nomination. More recently, and I'm sure you've watched this, Leah has been one of the ensemble cast and part of the writing team in Redfern Now, a 6-part ABC drama. There's the distinction of being the first series produced, directed, written and acted by Indigenous Australians. And I believe they're currently producing another series. Fantastic. I was hooked. Leah's now moved on to another phase in her life as a writer-director for television and film, and with her own production company. For our first story, please welcome Leah.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge country to the Turrbal and the Jagera, to any elders that are here, any other Murray people that are here, past and present, to our elders. My name's Leah Purcell. I'm a Gawagungri Waka Waka Murray woman, so that basically means Queensland through and not just for the football, okay? Although I live in Sydney and I do wear my maroon proudly. And I just want to say, I feel for you guys with all this rain. Bless yous, eh? Getting washed out. And thank you to the State Library for the invitation to be here today and to acknowledge my other speaker, Brother Cliff there. As I said, this is my first public speaking in 4 years, so I might be a little bit rusty, but I'll hopefully, it's like riding a bike, get back on and it'll be great. I've been a nana, so I've been doing nana duties for 4 years. I've got a 4-year-old grandson and 2 grandsons, a 4- and 2-year-old. So they've been keeping me in the real world, because as a writer, an actor, you're off in fantasy land more times than often. You're off in a world of make-believe, so it's nice to have my grandchildren that bring me back to reality. But also, it's also beautiful to be able to share stories with them, so I get the best of both worlds. When I was thinking about the importance of story, I said, gosh, to me, story is very important, not only just as a Aboriginal woman, because our oral stories, as Indigenous people, we've lost a lot, but someone said to me, what we do have is still our stories. And that's why I guess I'm a big advocate for Aboriginal people telling our own stories and being in control of those stories and where they end up and where they go. So, and also our stories is what has kept our culture alive. Some of our dance practices have gone with our elders, but at least we have those stories. Also, then there's the actor, writer, director in me these days, and without a story, I'm not employed. I'd be off cleaning toilets, although I do clean a good toilet. And when I retire, I think that's what I'll do. You sound really great when you sing in the bathrooms. And then, of course, my other role as a mother and a grandmother, to be able to share stories. And at the moment, with Raphael, the oldest boy, his Aboriginal name is Worimi, and Lysander, who's number 2, his Aboriginal name is Wan, which is Crow in my grandmother's language. So I try to put cultural stuff and use their names in stories, so I can, embed something, because I learnt with my oldest daughter, when you try to educate and sit them down, you've got to have this knowledge, you've got to move forward, whatever mum, and, they walk out the door and think you're a lunatic. So I'm trying to find another way with story to open up his curiosity into what his Aboriginal name is and what a strong young boy he is. He's the warrior, he's the fighter, he's the runner, and Lysander's a bit more creative like Nan, he's the dancer man. So it's nice. So, that's been absolutely wonderful to sit and create and use our imagination, and I guess to continue that oral process of us as as an Indigenous person, as we do with our history and culture. And also totally making something up. I want to do a story with Raph. He made it up, actually. It was called Bud the Baker Boy. About Raph, his other grandparents like to cook cakes. So it's about a little boy that goes on a walk in Africa and makes cakes for all the animals. So I'm righto. So every night we do that, and I get the cakes wrong, and the lion has the chocolate and the monkeys have the strawberries. And I said, don't they have bananas? He said, no, the giraffe has the bananas. So, I just love the fact that he's using his imagination, because I believe that is so important in regards to storytelling. I think that's what kept me at school, that I had an imagination where I could actually fill in the pictures. I wasn't a very good reader, still not a very good speller, so I hope I got all the spelling right. I was looking at that sitting there before going, gee, I didn't really check that. I'm one of those ones that start a sentence, forget the middle and then end it. So I hope it's all right. Importance is okay at the moment, yep, story. So I sort of say, where do I begin? Once upon a time there was a little girl who didn't like to go to school. Once upon a time there was a little girl who didn't really like English much. Once upon a time there was a little girl who didn't like to read. And once upon a time there was a little girl who couldn't spell. And if you would have said to that little girl in grade 1 when she got wrapped across the knuckles because she lost her place in a Nip and Dora, Dick and Fluff book, and then refused for the rest of her life to read publicly, and said to her that she'd have a 3-book deal, later in life and read for a living, I would have laughed at you and said, no way. But it was actually in grade 3. I knew I had a good imagination because my mum never, not so much read to me, but she always made up these amazing stories. So I had to use my imagination. And in grade 3, although my story was one big long sentence, this guy, we had a visitor to the school, and he stood beside me, picked up my story and was reading it. Then he threw the paper at me. He said, oh, ghosts can't write, because it was about a haunted house and the ghost actually wrote the story. I said, I thought that was really clever. Anyway, but it was from there, and I didn't think much more about it. And then in grade 7, there was a competition at the Mergen State School, which was run by the Lions Club. And it was to be based at a non-fiction story about your neighbours. And I said, I'm going to write about that, because I had a wonderful family on one side, an Aboriginal family, the Stanleys, and they had 7 children and I was number 8. And then on the other side there was an elderly man who was nice sometimes but not all the time when my ball would go into his yard. So I sort of wrote this comparison and I won. Before I say that I won, when I got my paper back, read throughout the whole thing, commas, full stops, capital letters, and then there was a little note, see me. And I thought, oh, really? So I stayed back and I thought I was going to be in really big trouble because I had all this red of my page, and the teacher said, it's a really, really good story. All we've got to do is get your grammar right and teach you to put a full stop in the right place and a comma. I still have trouble to this day. But I was all more about the creativity and the importance of just telling a story. Who cares whether there's a full stop? As long as it's engaging and as long as it's, it was from a personal place, that's what's important. So I went on to win the school, and then I won the South Burnett competition because they opened it up, and I won a beautiful silver pen. And, for someone who didn't like to read out loud, didn't like to read, didn't like to spell, never put a hand up much, I guess I didn't do too bad. And I would not have dreamt in a million years that writing would be a part of who I am today. And coming from my mum being a storyteller, my grandmother was a storyteller, crippled with arthritis and Parkinson's disease. Whenever there was a storm on, we'd go into her room, cover the mirrors because the lightning will strike, and we would sit and we would hear her stories. She could barely talk, but what she always rammed home was her stories of being taken, stolen. And I was a child of 5, 7, and all I knew was that the horses were brown, they were big, they chased them, and she never saw her parents or mother again. And it was a story that stuck with me, because then when I hit the crossroads at 15 and was trying to work out who I am and where I wanted to go, whether I was going to be a good kid or a bad kid, you know, those stories came back, and I think they're absolutely vital, because it absolutely gave me a grounding, it absolutely gave me an identity, and it gave me an understanding of the opportunity that I had that my grandmother didn't have, which I guess was my motivation, and it's still my motivation to this day. So I also thank my dad, who is white, because he's a great memory, had a great mind, 95 and still perfect, can remember back to floods in 2024. So I got the best of both worlds, my Indigenous side with the ability to tell a great story, and then my dad's side to retain and be able to recall. So I guess it was all planned. I just didn't know about it, but I'm on my journey, and I'm finding my way through. So once I had an opportunity when I went to Sydney after leaving Mergen, after doing Bran Nue Dae and a few plays. I did Low at the Belvoir, not Belvoir, wrong city, La Boite, and being able to tell someone else's story as an actor is also something else I'll talk about later. But I guess it was an opportunity to tell my own story. I was 27 when Box the Pony came about. I've jumped a bit on my slide, says to go to Black Chicks Talking, but I'll get back to that too. But it was purely because I wanted to act. It was the Festival of the Dreaming. Every black fella in Australia was acting in it, and no one had asked me yet. So I said to Rhoda Roberts, I said, look, I'll clean the toilets if you want. And she said, no, we might be able to find you something. Go away and write your story. I said, I'm 27. That's a bit rude, isn't it? Then I have runs on the board and you know, at least treaded a few more boards than the few that I have. And she said, no, I think you can tell a good yarn. So having that opportunity to be able to share my story, not only did it allow me, I co-wrote that with Scott Rankin. I said, I don't want it to be a therapy lesson, but I know it will. But I want it to be good theatre because I want to reach my audience and I want to make it a universal story. I think everyone's story is universal. And then our cultural background is what sprinkles it with its uniqueness or its specialness. And I always call it, when I do my stories, my little bit of black pepper that I sprinkle through. I think a story is universal, and it's important for it to be universal so that everyone can engage with it and find some sort of understanding. Talking about my Nan's story, back in the late, I've got to get me dates right, late 90s, early 2000, when there was the movement for reconciliation. I was going around with the likes of Noel Pearson, Aidan Ridgway, and a few non-Indigenous people and a few other Indigenous people, and we'd go around to various places and give our perspective on what reconciliation means. And I mean, purely I was there for the entertainment side. I'd get up and sing my Nana's song, which was a story she told me, and I converted it into a song to be able to, that's where I felt it needed to sit in me. And I think I was gifted with it because I wrote it in 10 minutes and I only ever changed one word. So I think I was just the vessel for my Nan to channel, and she had passed on at this time. But I sort of said to people, and there was people debating, you know, what land rights meant, what reconciliation meant, what's black politics. You know, with anything Indigenous, it's always got that political tag. But I was there for the heart and soul. So I sung my song and I said to them, you can't deny my Nana this story, because to deny her story, she doesn't exist. And I said, and she does, because this is her story. It's up to you whether you want to believe whether she was taken and how that happened and how that affected her and how it affects generations to come. I said, but you cannot take her story from her, because that's what she knows. And I always stand by that. So I think stories are so important in our multicultural society, not just between black and white, but the true multicultural society of Australia. There's so many stories out there, and there's so much learning to be had to bring about understanding. You know, I'm not fully aware of the situation in Logan, but maybe if those people possibly could have understood their stories, and I'm sure it's a lot more deeper than that, but would that have ceased something, or at least brought about some sort of understanding or a possible recognition in one another? And that's just across the boards with our refugees that come and the immigrants, you know, all of that. If we understand where they've come from, it simply might be a little bit easier to tolerate, take on board, and to give them some understanding as well. Personal stories. My big one of the questions I said, what do you want me to talk about? They said, well, my involvement in personal experience of the human stories. Well, Black Chicks Talking, oh my goodness, this taught me heaps. The headaches, the heartaches, my goodness, and the hard work that goes into capturing and collecting, receiving and honouring other people's stories. This was massive. It took me 3 years. It started out as a book, then it went to a doco, then it went to the stage play, and then of course the book. In the book there was 10 women's stories, 10 to collect. My goodness. And what I wanted myself as the person who was collecting these stories, the story getter, to know that the people I was taking the stories from was that they could trust me, that they felt that I would be the sentinel for their stories, that they actually had control over their stories. My publisher fell on the floor and had a heart attack. But I said, I trust that I will be able to communicate my concerns with these other women for them to give over their stories. Some of the women I knew, some of them I didn't know at all, and was absolutely... there was one woman who I was just a fan of, whose story... I invited her into the book, and I had no idea of her story. And when she left the room, I literally laid on the floor and cried and said, I can't do this. I felt that I was being rude to come into her story because it was so heartfelt and it was still very raw to her. I don't think she had dealt with it completely herself. But I found through the telling of my own story that I was dealing with my own personal demons, and I believe that I've become a stronger person for it. Not everyone has an opportunity to get up and perform their own story, but I think even if it was just to write a letter to yourself and just to talk about who you are as a person and where you fit on the big scale of your family's life, your life's journey, and the story that is around you. In the collecting, so this took me 3 years from the go of coming up with the list of women, going out or bringing them to Sydney to allow them to sit and talk for about 3 hours with 2 sessions in various places. We went to hotel rooms, we went to parks, we went to people's offices, dinner, that always helps. And to gather the stories and then to sit down and go through them and read them and then find the guts of it. And, there was a lot of tears that were shed from myself at the labour, a lot of sacrifice in getting the stories. But I do pride myself on that the women actually had the final edit. And I felt really good because there's no way I can get up and talk about something that I had done like this if I did not have the blessing of all the women that were part of this process. I won't mention any names because this is going web-wide out in the world there. But there was one script that came back and there was just these big red Nico pens, marker pens, through it. I'm going, oh my goodness. What am I going to do here? But it was great. Part of my responsibility, and I think part of your responsibility as people that are going to go out and get these stories, is to have the patience. It taught me patience, and it taught me to think before I opened my mouth, and it taught me to be aware of other people's emotions and what it means to give your personal story. So I took many deep breaths, rung up and just spoke through the process. And it actually made me work really hard in understanding their story. And I'm really thankful for the fact that they put me through the ringer because I had to learn it. I had to read it over and over to the point that I got sick of it and hated it. I don't think you've worked hard enough if you don't hate your writing and if you don't hate your characters, because then they're going to come back and bite you on the bum and there's going to be something missing. So, and because of that, it allowed me to really dive deep and get into their stories and understand them. So when they had any concerns, or then once they released these, and being Indigenous people, we released these stories back so that I demanded that they got a family member to read the stories. Now, and once again, my publicist fell on the floor and had a heart attack. She's going, Leah, you're killing me. She goes, you'll have a book of maybe 1 page and that's your opening forward. And I said, no, I trust that I'm doing the right thing. I trust that I'm doing the right thing, and if you are doing the right thing and getting these stories, they will come to fruition. And as soon as I sat down and spoke, there was about at least 5 of the 10 women where it was lots of phone calls. One was a lawyer. I think I can tell this story because she's my cousin. But she had a worry. She told a joke, just an example of the extremes one must go through. She did a joke about the horse's hair with the wigs of the lawyers and the barristers. And she rings me out of the blue and just panicked. She said, got to take it out. I said, but it's really cool. It's great to see you not being the serious barrister all the time. So it's nice for you to take, be telling a joke about yourself. And she said, I really need to get someone to tell me higher up than me that it's okay. So she was in Brisbane on the phone. I had a judge in Sydney on the phone. I had my TV, the recorder in my mouth, going, hang on a minute, I'm just going to press play and you can hear the joke and then you tell me and then I'll come back. That's what I did, touching it with my toes, turning it on with my nose, and away the segment, it was for the documentary actually, it was the way the segment played and, I'm relaying, no, he really said yes, I'm not lying, no, did you say yes? So it was this craziness, but I got the joke, it gave her another side to her persona. So I guess in all of this, my lesson was you have to work hard. And you have to get the trust of the people. And that's really important, especially Indigenous people. I had an opportunity to go over to America, the US in 2004 with the Eisenhower Fellowship. And part of my tag on my CV was storyteller. And I went into a lot of the African American communities, and I also went into the Native American communities. And because they saw storyteller and me being fair skinned, they thought I was there to take their stories. And that's the non-Indigenous people going into them, taking the stories and then forgetting where they got them from and not giving them any acknowledgement or recognition of where that story came from. So I had to really earn my place in telling them I'm not here to take stories, I'm here to share. And it took a while for them to sort of trust. And I think that's really important with Indigenous people. It happened with my own story, Box the Pony, where I literally had to get my copyright back and it had to go through a court process. There was a lot of stories around that time where non-Indigenous writers would come and work. They were writers for hire, where they'd come and work with myself and a few other plays that were being written at the time, but we didn't own our own stories. I said, I understand that the labour or the structural purpose came from the non-Indigenous person, but unless you, I said, I don't care how good you are, brother, there's no way that you could come up with this story because it came from my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and from me, and that's women's business. I said, I appreciate your intelligence and how you're going to take my story to another level to provide it for a structure for theatre, because I was very new at that stage. I said, but there's no way in the world I'm going to let you say that you own my story. And I think that's something important, and that sort of stuff must be told to the person that you're getting off. So, and that happened in 1997, and I'm working on another project at the moment with another Aboriginal girl working with a non-Indigenous writer, and it brought tears to my eyes to see the copyright. The Aboriginal girl's name was first and then the writer, and I said, that's what it should be, because our stories come orally to us and we give them orally, but it's still ours to claim. So I think that's really important, especially with our Indigenous mob, that they know that they are still, that is theirs, because that's all we got. That's all we got, and that's who we are these days. So, and I think probably, I'm not sure, with other multicultural people, where their stories are important to them cultural-wise, it must be, you must stipulate that this story is still yours, and for them to still have some input. It's up to you to come up with a clever way to keep what you need in there. And that's what I did, even with my own story. I sat down my mother's sisters and said to them, if you're going to hit me, hit me. Hello, I've got cousins in the audience. If you're going to hit me, hit me. If you're going to kiss me, kiss me. But if you don't understand something, please ask. And I will tell you why I've put that in or why that's there. And there was aunts that also said, I think you need to take that out. And they gave their reasoning, and I said, you know what, you're right. So I think there's got to be that two-way. If we're going to be the getters, if we're the story collectors, you know, and there's things that you need, then I think you need to have a plan so that everyone feels comfortable and those stories are given, you know, freely, but knowing that they still have control and their names are going to be connected to that, or cultural stuff, especially with mob, because we have to go back to family. You know, with Box the Pony, I did a secret out-of-town tryout, and 90% of the audience was my family. The front row was my mother's sisters and aunties. And I said to the director at the time was, and the co-writer, I said, well, if they don't like it, that's it. And they went, what do you mean that's it? And I said, well, can't do it, can I, if they don't sort of agree with what I'm saying? And they said, yeah, but Leah, we've got a tour. From here you go to Sydney, and then you're going to go to Brisbane and Adelaide, and you might even go to London. And I went, oh, okay, cool. I said, but if they don't like it, then I can't do this. And but there were a few that, you know, didn't like some things, but I had a plan, and I listened, and I understood what the story I was telling, so that I could, you know, squash their concerns with my truth and my understanding. And, you know, I went on to perform that for 3 years, and I had an opportunity in 2007 when I was in the US to do a reading of it on Broadway. It was 110 Street, on the corner of 110th Street and 42nd Street. So I did have to walk down 42nd Street to get there. So, you know, if I was doing wrong, then there's no way that I would have been able to sustain that. It's because I took the time and effort. And I'm telling you, I cried rivers, sleepless nights, you know, sitting at a computer and, you know, eating junk food, and then all of a sudden you go put a pair of jeans on and they don't fit anymore. You know, the labour that goes into it. And I just think if you don't hate something, then you haven't loved it passionately and worked hard enough on it and done the hard yards to go back to the people that you've collected those stories from, and for them to be happy. You know, on another level, there was another writer, there was another one of the women in Black Chicks Talking. Just before the print button was pressed, she rang me up crying, saying, my brother's read it and he's not happy. And then I said, no worries, what do we need to do? And she said, it's the beginning. And I said, well, you explain to me. And because they trusted me, they told me some pretty straight things. There was one girl that I said, never repeat this again, and I deleted it in front of her. I said, reporters, reviewers, you know, would have a field day with that. Don't say that. And I said, and watch this, and I deleted it. And then with this other girl, when she rung and said her brother's not happy with it, I said, okay, now tell me another way, that our beginning, because it was pretty strong. And we came up with it. And then just as I was leaving, I said, you know what? I said, if this is wrong, her father who had passed, I said, he'd let us know. And the next morning, 6 o'clock the next morning, she goes, just want to let you know, Leah, that Dad came to me last night in this wonderful warm light and said, we have to do this, because it's going to bring about understanding. I get emotional talking about it. It's going to bring about understanding of us contemporary Indigenous mob dealing with who we are today and what our old people went through in when they denied, some of them denied their Aboriginality because they thought that it was best to move forward and not known. Because in those days, if they spoke culture, spoke about it, acknowledged, they were punished. So and I know that these stories, I wouldn't do this and go through all the pain and the heartache if I didn't know there was a healing process through it for the people involved, but for the wider community. My goodness, the letters that I received, the many organisations of little young women still in high school that formed their own Black Chicks Talking, more Murray Chicks Talking. There was a Lebanese group out at Blacktown that sent me, you know, so not only was it in the Indigenous communities, but the wider communities, and they said, thank you for sharing these stories, because now it makes me want to go home and talk to my family. And so, and then part of my process was for the women to know about Box the Pony, that I shared my stories, and I was really honest with them of the heartache, the trials and tribulations with family, extended family, of what I went through, and told them to be prepared. So I actually prepared them. I said, but there's a reason why you've been chosen. I believe that I do what I do. There's a greater power. I believe in my ancestors. This skin colour for a reason. Over in the Native Americans, in the Gila people, which is the Navajo, gave me the name of White Wolf. They said, you're a front runner for your people. They said, you're a tall woman, big shoulders, and you can walk in two worlds. You understand the white man's tongue and you understand your family's black tongue. And they said, you're the translator. So all the knocks and the hits that you get, that's part of your journey. So it made me feel good, you know. And then my other aunt said, you're getting your initiation on the inside from the thing that you do. Those knocks and hits and punches and screams and scratches are all part of the journey of getting a good story and getting it out there and having that trust in people. So part of the process was the women to understand where I came from so that they felt that they could trust me in giving me their story. And I really want to push on that, because I don't think we do it enough. We don't care about there's a new generation, I'm talking 10 years ago, where these stories came from. And I think it's really important for whoever birthed that story needs that acknowledgement all the way through, and for them to be a part of the process. Even if it's a phone call to just say, hey, it's all going great. You know, everyone wants to tell a story. Now, where was I going? Oh, yeah, going on about understanding story and going back and collecting story. I did some stuff with, I was there for 4 years with the Aboriginal Centre for Performing Arts, with ACPA, and that was really interesting with this younger generation. I guess I was one of the last generations to actually sit down at the feet of my elders and be given that oral story. Yes, it might have been around a carton of Forex, but I would never change it for the world, because I think I was very lucky to be around my elders, to share in a cultural experience of the oral story, to share in our contemporary dreaming, I call it, when the yarns became about when they went hunting and thought that they had these birds on a wire fence and they stayed there for hours, and when they creep in closer, it was a plastic bag stuck on, but here they want to get this big bird and all of this sort of stuff. So just little things that over 40,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, when crobberies were being made, they were about everyday occurrences. And I love the fact that I'm crobberying here today. We're part of a dreaming because we're telling yarns and we're sharing. So I get excited. So when I went to ACPA and with all these kids from all over Australia, the first show we did, because it was, I think it was 40 years referendum, 50 years for something else. I might have got my dates back to front. But anyway, I wanted them to referendum. And when I said the word referendum, it was like I swore at them. They went, what? One kid put her hand and said, Aunt, I don't even know how to spell it. And I said, me and you both, but we'll talk about that later. There's a few R's in there. I said, but we'll talk about that later. But it really saddened me that our not everyone in the school, of course there was older students and they knew, but the younger ones, how naive and ignorant, if I dare say it, to what our plight has been of our elders. So I said to him, stop you this way, with that mobile phone, texting, and this way computer. And I said, go and look into the eyes of your elders and ask them for a story. And they thought I swore at them again. It was like, what? And but I said, because you guys have to come back with stories for the play that we are going to create. If we don't have those stories, then we have nothing to tell. And I said, as Indigenous students of this school, the first name is Aboriginal Centre of Performing Arts, I said, then if you're going to come here, then you know the history. I said, because, you've got to know where we come from to know where you're going. I said, and to not have a negative tone about you, but to have be positive. Yes, we come from hard times, but there's nothing stopping us to take that as our fuel, as our motivator, and to go forward and prosper and do great things. So it was a whole new thing for them to go and actually sit down with an elder and listen. Has technology taken away that oral being of looking someone in the eye and sharing a story with them and hoping it resonates and stays with someone? So that was a big eye-opener, and a massive eye-opener for the students when they came back. I'll just flick through because I'm proud of the poster that we come up with. I'll come back to these ones. See, I knew I'd make a mistake. Where were we? Oh, there it is. And it's about having your past with you, but walking towards the future and understanding what the referendum meant for our people. And then a couple of years later we did Stolen, which was a play that was already written by Jane Harrison, Yorta Yorta woman from Victoria. And then for them to understand the stolen generation, it was, once again, they had no idea. And I don't know whether, as a storyteller, there's something that oozes, tell me your story, can you write it for me? But everywhere I go, people go, oh, how can I tell you my story? You know, I said, the first thing you just got to do is sit down and write it down on a piece of paper, tell yourself, so you know what story you want to tell. But a lot of these, and when we did this, you know, I said to them, I said, you need to go home and find out if you have anyone that was taken in your family. And it was just an amazing experience for these students to go home. One girl said she hadn't spoken to her grandmother on her dad's side for nearly 10 to 15 years. And I said, I bet you she's waiting for the phone call. And she come into school and our rehearsal time, and she's standing there twiddling her fingers, and I said, what's wrong, bub? And she said, I rung my nan. And as soon as she picked up the phone and I said, yes, she went, I've been waiting for this call. I said, see, I told you. I said, but as young people, we have to show that we are willing to listen and to be open. And I think that as a getter, you have to be willing to just listen. And it taught me to, you know, because sometimes you get too anxious and you want to, you know, come in on the story. It taught me to shut up, you know, and to sit and to listen. And yes, you're going to go through heartache. When I went for my grandmother's story, through Auntie, bless her now, she's passed away, then Ruby Duncan, Auntie Ruthie Hegarty's mum, she growled at me first, what do you want this? I said, I need to know who I am. I need to know where this began. And I sat there for at least a good hour before she trusted me to open up, and when she did, oh my goodness, what an experience it was. So then all of a sudden, all these grandparents, when my grandchildren are interested in where I come from and where I've been, and the change in the students was just amazing. We had this big day where I just knew they were on the emotional edge of collapse. So, and if you know the play Stolen, it is a massively heavy piece of work, and it was almost like these children went through this initiation, understanding someone else's interpretation of it through the play that was already written, and then making them to understand it and find depth. I made them go home and look for their stories and how they can personally connect. And this day I knew at the end of rehearsals, I turned all the lights out, and we just had this moment for about an hour. And the beautiful thing is everyone was crying. I said, let's get angry, let's get sad, let's cry together, male, boys and all. And then all of a sudden I said, now we've got to find our pride in the journey of where we've come from and who we are. And oh my goodness, it was gum trees, mate, just sprung up everywhere in the room, and the pride. And then these students it just clicked for them. So once again, story is so important for grounding, for the grounding of who we are. And that's why we need so much more from the personal story. We've all got our historians that wrote the books, but we need those personal stories. I think that's going to take us into the future. It's all going to be so technical, but I think we still have to remember a good story comes from a heart and soul, and it can only come from you or you or you, you know, the personal experience. And we could be unearthing some amazing things that could go to someone's grave. And that's why I do what I do. You got to be a detective. I love the detective work. I love getting in and you know, even with there's another book that I want to write, and it's about my family history, and you know, just the little things that pop up, and you just sort of, you know, piecing it together, and it's I love that. That's my drug. That's what I get off on, being a bit of detective and finding it and trying to make sense of it, and then, you know, go on to the elders or make even phone calls, you know, to say, what's your interpretation of this? And then finding the common ground, or a story that everyone is satisfied with. And then you never, you know, and as a black company and organisation with, I had Bungaburra Productions in Umbara, it's sort of like we're the hunters as well. You've got to use everything of it. Don't let anything go away. That's why we do documentaries. That's why I did books. That's why I did stage plays. Not saying that we all have to do that. I think just to get them. But you never know where they might go or what people might want you to do. You know, I've got a lot of aunts in my family that want to tell their story as well. And I said, well, there's only one of me. I need about 8 to get to you all. I said, but there's nothing stopping today. You know, just start at once upon a time and get to the end. And, you know, your story's down for things to be done with later on. There's, you know, it's endless what we can do with a really with a story. Whether it's, you know, and as some of them said, whether it's harrowing, crazy, horrendous, complex, simple, you know, a story will always affect someone, somewhere, sometime, when they, you know, when they need that strength or determination or just purely to enjoy something. You know, that's great about being an actor. You know, I get to stimulate people for the good and the bad. You know, I think it's all great whether you move someone. I love playing Condoleezza Rice when stuff happens. It was great to be hissed at and spat at in Melbourne. It was brilliant. I was on stage and this guy in the front row, I won't say the word he said, I started with B, that's not too bad, is it? And he went, you know, and I went, yes. You know, because I was doing my job, and that's what you want. So through that story, he was stimulated to hate that character. And as an actor, that's the biggest reward, you know. And then also to receive letters or people come up at the end of the show and said, thank you. There was one woman that brought a date to Box the Pony, and she said, oh, I told him where to go at the end of it. And I went, oh, sorry. She said, no, it was a good thing. It was a good thing. She said, she walked out, you know, 6'5", and I said, and that's the power of story. You know what I mean? You're changing people's lives for that moment. And I went, and yeah, she went on to find the love of her life and live happily ever after. So, you know, I can't stress enough how much I believe that stories are important. And not only the stories of the past, but who we are right now. As I said before, we're creating a dreaming, we're contemporary dreamings. And I say this, I should have, how do I go backwards? Hey, I can go backwards. Learning. Where am I? You know, and if we talk about our contemporary dreaming, you know, this to me, this is She Say. It came out of Box the Pony, a moment around the domestic violence. So it's also nice, to, as I said, to take an element of a play and develop it further. So I created a short film, and it was about the psychology of a woman having to decide whether to go back to the abusive partner because one child loved him and wanted him home, and the other child who saw the violence was so against it. You know, what do women do in this? And I ended with nothing being said, and people went, oh! And I said, well, you know, the women who have suffered this know what the answer is, or maybe not. So the power in storytellings of this human quality is really important. I guess a lot of my work is I base it on fact. And of course, when you're doing things for film and television and for the theatre, there is a creative license where you have to blow it out a little bit or thread something through because you know, there's a structure in place when you're selling film, television and theatre. But I guess a lot of my writing is always based on fact, and I'll always have, you know, 3 lines in there that are my truth. And for people that are, I guess, close to me would know that, but to anyone else, it's just part of a story. And I think that's a big thing too. Sometimes when you're taking other people's stories and you're utilising it, and especially more so with film and television where you have to fictionalise it a bit to cater for the dramatics in it, you sort of can reassure them that not everyone knows your personal story. You know, Box the Pony is semi-autobiographical. You know, it's probably one scene that's not true, you know. But I said to my family, we know that. But the wider community does accept it for that it is a theatre piece. Of course, what you guys will be doing, and down the track, is getting the truth from the people and putting it in, you know, that element or structure of just a pure story. So I guess you've got a warning to the person giving the story that know that this will be out in the public domain. So think about what you really want to say. And then you guys, as the, you know, when you come to edit, you know, lead with your heart so that if something you feel is not quite right and you wouldn't want to know the wider public know if that was your family, then act on it, because 9 times out of 10 it'll be something that probably needs to be deleted in that sense. Coming into the contemporary times, Redfern Now was just amazing to be a part of the process, and I think it absolutely came at the right time. Because we want to know, like a lot of our stories, our histories, is our past, is what Aboriginal people were back in those days. And then we get the conflict of people like me going, hang on a minute, who are you? What are you? You can't be a real one. I said, well, no, we've survived for so long because we've evolved and we've moved with the times, and we're here today and we come in all shapes, sizes and colours. And I think Redfern Now was a great depiction of that. It was so black that our paper was black and we actually had white print, ink. No, I lie. That's my joke, I lie. But wouldn't it have been great if they did? No, a lot of ink wasted on that black paper. No. That was absolutely wonderful to have executive producers, two very strong black women in Sally Riley and Erica Glenn, to then the writers, and they, in the first series, I think it was still top-heavy males again, but there was two female writers, and then to have Indigenous directors, and we had 4 women and 1 male, so we came back that way in the girls' stakes. And I think that's why we got it right, because the stories came from Indigenous people and we understood where we needed to go with them and how we were going to bring them to fruition, how we were going to make sure that they're portrayed truthfully on the screen. And I think that's why it resonated and it reached so many people. And I'm not talking just black fellas, white fellas, yellow fellas, any fellas. The amount of feedback through the Facebook and the Twitters was from very multicultural, and people saying, I could relate to that. But it just happened to be sprinkled with a bit of black pepper, as I call it, and we came from an Indigenous perspective about this particular issue, and we were sitting at people's dining tables. We were brought into their houses as opposed to a cop shop or a hospital room. But I think the importance was that we were telling contemporary dreaming stories of our times today, which was really exciting. And I think those stories need to be told as well. Black Chicks Talking, Box the Pony was all about what it's like to be a black woman in today's society, a contemporary black woman in today's society, and hanging on. Have I gone over? No. Hanging on. Gee, that time went quick. Did it all make sense? Am I making sense so far? 1 minute it was there and now it's up there. But it is important to collect our stories of from today and into the future as to where we've come from and where we're going, so that we do have that really great balance. And there's many ways, to record, to keep, to preserve. But you've got to have that awesome way to dig, to find, and to be the receiver. And I think that's important, to be open to all things. I'm just checking my notes to make sure I've covered. Someone, before we open up to questions, that might help me get me back on track. I don't know what happened to my display. Anyway, that's Lisa Flanagan from 7 Stages of Grieving. I directed Wesley's, Enoch and Deb Mailman wrote 7 Stages of Grieving, and I did my interpretation of it with the Sydney Theatre Company. Parramatta Girls was Alana Valentine had wrote it, but that was verbatim theatre, and we actually got to meet all the women that were in the Parramatta Girls' home. We actually, 2 of them went and broke into the home a couple of nights before we all met them, because they wanted to go back down into the dungeons. And so when we all went out for a walk, they took us down there and spoke quite openly and honestly about the brutality that went through. And you know what was beautiful about these women is that they just went, thank you for listening. I don't care if you believe me or not, but I can feel that you honestly wanted to hear my story, and it's helped me a lot to get out of that dark and dingy place and to share and to know that I've been heard. And that was massive for us as actors, because normally we're the ones talking, and it was just beautiful to let these women tell their stories. We had a few tears, but I think that's a really big, important, it is therapy, whether we like it or not, to share those stories. You know, and to cover there's so many issues that you cover when you just get one person's story, and how much you can take away from that. Someone said, what's the magic of a story? And I think it's, you know, everyone to their own, each to their own. But for me, the magic was I love to be transported into someone else's world for a moment, for a time, to walk in their shoes, or at least be standing by them and to hear what they went through. I like to experience emotion. I cry at the news, bless me. You know, maybe that's just the actor. I've been doing it too long. But to experience and to share when someone is angry or when someone is hurting, you know, and to experience that. I think we all need a lot more stimulation in us as human beings with tapping into our emotions, you know, and being honest and open with them. I said I like the visual stimulation, not just by pictures, but by what your mind can create. And you know, the story in your head is far more outrageous than what probably the person's true story is. Maybe it's just me with my active imagination, ghosts writing stories. And then, as I said, and then the privilege you feel by receiving something from someone who has trusted you as a listener is also a wonderful gift, and the magic of storytelling. You know, I believe, you know, stories are really the food of our souls and who we are, and very much so earthing, especially in young people. And I can talk on behalf of Indigenous kids. We've got to know where we've come from, and it absolutely helped me to know, to be this little girl, 7, 8, to recall stories that my mother, my uncles and aunt told around family get-togethers. It really grounded me and made me stay on my true path of where I need to be here, talking about stories today even. And as I said before, you know, we might think our stories aren't important, but there will be someone out there who will take something from this stuff. So let's go forth and collect as many stories as we can, because once they're gone, they're gone. So 15 minutes question, are we on time? Have I gone over time? Am I sort of around the right time?
We're
Bang on time, so we can question time? Yeah.
When you're taking a story, do you have a checklist of questions you want to ask the person that you're talking to? Is there a special checklist? Yeah,
sometimes I do, and sometimes everyone. Yeah, of course you heard the questions on microphone. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. I like to be surprised as well, and that's when the listening comes in. Is when if they start. And they start on their story, that you're listening so that you can bounce off, you know, and go to different places and to make them recall things. But I must admit, with Black Chicks Talking, we had one question and there was an A and B to it. So if they would have said no comment, I was probably going to be in big trouble, because it was my first sort of book like that. But we wanted, being a performer, I'm interviewed a trillion times, you know, and sometimes I get bored with my own story and the way people approach me, you know, so tell me where it all began. You go, oh, really? So what I did with Black Chicks Talking was I asked the women what, out of the 5 senses, what do they relate to? Touch, sight, hearing, taste, smell. And then it totally went, oh, wow, what a great question. And then when they said something, so if they said, oh, mine was touch, I said to them, part B, thank goodness I ticked it off in my little head. Yes, they answered it. And part B was, can you remember the first memorable, delightful touch? And then away they went. Oh, yeah, it was from my mum, or it was from my puppy dog licking me when I was 3. And then they opened up really quickly and really honestly, because I made them, they just never thought that way. They were prepared to be, yes, I'm 27 and I work at this, and totally grabbed them, and they dived in deep. And then we had these really descriptive stories because they could dive in here. So that's the only trick I got. Be clever and have maybe one more question just in case they say no comment on the first one. But no, I don't like to be too technical. I think, when you got your, you're going in to ask people about their personal stories, then how do you want to, how would you like to be approached? It's a cup of tea and a biscuit, g'day, how are you, and a clever way to open up conversation. And I think if you're going to be collecting these stories, you need to go more than one time to that person. I wouldn't just rock up on a Sunday and say, remember me, I rung you 6 months ago? Here I am. It's that personal touch if you want deep stories that are really going to affect our readers and future readers to come.
And my second question is, because of reconciliation being a part of the social science curriculums at school, do you ever take your plays into the classroom, especially the ones stolen?
Not really, because with Stolen it's a cast of many, and technically it wouldn't come across, but they study it, and a lot of the theatre places have special matinees for schools to go to, so they can get it that way. So they were experiencing the whole theatrical piece. I know that there's every now and then a school might ring up the writer, or I know a couple of times I've been asked to go in and speak as the actor being involved in that play or a particular process, to talk to more so the drama students. But it's massive, and more access should be, there should be more of it, but it just gets technically difficult.
Hi, sorry, thank you for sharing. I was just wondering if you would do us the honour of singing your grandmother's story.
Maybe towards the end, but I'd probably ask the cameras to turn off, and because I've never made money out of it, and I just think when I'm singing it, I'm sharing it to you personally, as opposed to going web wide. But we'll see how we go. Good question. I might be warmed up. Gosh, I haven't done it for a while. No. Any more? Yeah, there's one. Oh, that was just Oh, okay, cool. Haven't done it for a while. I have to remember the words. Oh, pressure. Yeah, we can all go. No, this is good. Good acoustics. That's not the problem. Whether I remember the tune, no. It always comes back. Oh, yep, sorry, yep. No.
Is that on? Oh.
That's on. You're in the house.
Thank you for sharing your stories, and one thing that I've been really touched by listening to you speak, sorry, it's very emotional, this whole world, and there's a lot of grief through the stories that you're telling, and I'm just wondering about how you personally deal with that, like hearing all these stories and being the vehicle through which you then pass them on. And I know that there's this thing about that it can't, well, in some ways it's therapy, but in another way it's actually, an art form, and so, but does it kind of wear you down to?
Yeah, absolutely wears you down. But call me crazy, but I realise that if I'm worn down, then I'm doing the right thing by it because I'm working really hard. But yeah, the emotional stuff, I think you've got to find a room that you're comfortable in and cry yourself. Meditation, balancing your chakras, it's important. because I went to a guy who did that and he said, "Oh, you've been through a battlefield," and I went, "Tell me about it." And just, I think, you gotta, but I think you got to acknowledge that it's bloody hard work. It is going to hurt, but the end result and the many people that you're going to help is what got me through. It was the letters that came in, that people just said, "Thanks for collecting these stories, because it's really helped me in many aspects." But it's hard. It's hard, and I think and I did a lot of. There was a big period of about 15 years where also collecting these stories, talking with them women, then going out into communities and working with the young people, the young women, sharing these stories. I'd come back. I'd been to war, and holding them, but I just felt, well, if I can help them alleviate some of their pain, I have to work out a way to channel it off and to get rid of it. And that's, a game of netball, push and shove, running, boxing, get out on the big bag. But you've got to look after yourself, because you will be receiving so much emotional stuff, and the good, the bad, and the happy of all of that too. There is great stories of success and triumph that are in those places as well. But you do have to be prepared for the grief and be kind to yourself.
Can I just say how inspiring it is for you to hear you talk about transforming that into the positive, and that becomes fuel for the positive, and it's just, I really honour the work that you're doing.
Oh, great, thanks. Oh, I'm glad that came through. Lucky button.
Yeah, it's on. Thank you as well for all the work. I've watched Stolen and Referendum, and we were all very moved by it. We went as a group with a lot of families and brought our children. And I've often wondered, we're receiving all those stories, and there's your own issues, I guess, to deal with when you're doing that, as you're talking about. But then what about remaining connected to all the people who've told you those stories? Does that become difficult, impossible, and unwieldy, all those stories?
Yeah, look, it is kind of impossible. With Black Chicks Talking, of course, majority of the girls are in the industry, so we see them on a regular basis. And I said, we'll have to do another book. We've all got children now, and they've all had boys, so we go from the Black Chicks to the Black Chicks with their baby boys. But in that sense, but I guess you've got the multimedia now, the Facebooks and all that, where you can keep in touch. But I think it's, it is important every now and then to, give that phone call back and just to see how that person is. Once again, it's that labour you have to go. If I'm going to drive down this path in 5 years' time, I'm going to have to pick that phone up and just, how are you? Because we shared something. And it can be as simple as that, and that person does appreciate that phone call. And, then they might sort of say, oh, I wish I didn't tell you that bit, but I like the way you did that, And you go, yep, no worries. So you do have to have a shield. You do have to have armour and be prepared to get things thrown at you every now and then. But I think they do appreciate those phone calls and being able to, share with you, what they think years later, of what they've given you. And then you just have to be there to reassure that, no, it's all good, and send on the letters that come through and hope that they've, healed and gained from it as well. And
the Indigenous students that you worked with,
yep.
I wonder if there's any great stories, because they would have had amazing transformation working with you. I wonder where they've gone, what they're doing. Oh,
there's a couple, yes, great, they've gone out and done some great things. So that was good. The little cluster that I had, here's one of them right now, sitting up the front, working at the State Library. Hello, darling. Yeah. But I think on that, even if the students, ended up working in a sandwich sandwich shop, or a factory, or become garbage collectors, they're going to do it absolutely superbly because of the experience of what they had and the strength in their story and being proud and who they are. And that's all you can really want. If they go on to do wonderful things and achieve in the entertainment industry, then that's a bonus. But I just know that the earthing and the grounding they had through that process of referendum and Stolen, they became different people. Would you say that, Eleanor? You were there-ish? Yes.
Oh, hi. Thanks for sharing your stories. I was just really interested, you talk about gathering stories from people in person by sitting and listening. I was just wondering if you had any accounts of when you, if people have passed, you don't often get the chance to speak to them. You're kind of looking through their letters or photographs. I wondered if you had any stories about how you connected with stories in that way, not personally, but through collections. My mother had this old purse that was full of photos, and it wasn't till later in life, and she passed away when I was quite young, and every now and I go, gee, I wish Mum was alive and I could ask that question or get her perspective on that. And it was the photos, and then I finally sort of said the simple question of why was my mother so protective of this purse? Where did these photos come from? And so I asked that question of myself, and I went, I'm going to have to be the detective and go on the path. And I found out that someone had given my grandmother, the one that was stolen, a box brownie camera. And she took all these photos. How they could afford to get them developed or whatever. And I went, oh, how cool is that? My nan had the eye, of going around doing this. Trying to find, and then, so when I look back at those photos, I looked at them with a different eye and tried to see where she was coming from and but the trouble is we'll never really know. That's the thing. If only the photos could come to life. As they say, behind every photo there's a story, isn't there, to bring those stories to life. So that's why we've got to collect them now. But it is difficult. You can go back and there was a couple of photos where I went through my mum's sisters and they said, yes, I remember the box brownie camera. But some people have great recall but they sort of went, oh yeah, no, I can't remember. Maybe they're just going, no, you'll write this down and use this. There's been a few of those. I go to family barbecues and they go, watch this one, watch what you say around her. I said, it's not that bad. Repeat what you just said. I've always got a pen and a little bit of paper sitting in the corner. That's why I'll be very quiet and offer to make the tea. So that's the harder, and that's where the detective comes in, where you've got to go find that story and hopefully can comment on it, or do something. That's my next book, where it's a lot more relying on papers and oral stories that hopefully can be recalled.
Thank you. My question has two parts. Okay. No, one of them is the challenges of collecting stories across cultures.
Yeah.
Right? And I recall what you were saying in terms of when you were in America and some of the challenges there. And I also recall a line from a song that something goes like, a white middle-class woman. What are some of the, processes that we can use to cross some of those barriers? And is there a resistance against, jumping that divide?
Yeah, look, with my example of Black Chicks talking in Box the Pony, I actually got the women to either come and see me perform Box the Pony, or I gave them the DVD to watch, or I gave them the book to read. So they saw me sharing. Absolutely, there was resistance from. There was probably about 3 who sort of went, "No, go away." But I guess what was easier, like I've had a lot of Indigenous men come up to me and said, "Sis, when are you going to write the Black Bucks Bragging?" They come up with the title. That's what they said, and I said, but as an Indigenous woman, I don't feel that it's my place to think. But it was beautiful. One of the boys said, "But we trust you," and I said, "Yeah, but how can I dig deep
as I did with the women and get so personal, because I feel that's not right. And I'm a big advocate for that, because if you notice, all my work is to do with women, and I just feel, especially culturally, if we're going to stick by our cultural rules, that it should be men collecting the men's story, because only the men can talk as deep, and rightly so. But that's just me. Maybe there's other people who have other views. But I just feel if we're going to carry on some sort of cultural thing, then women's business is women's business, men's business is men's business. How do we multicultural, how do we cross that divide? I think women should stick with the women. I think you need to build trust. It's not just one phone call and one time. It's meeting, sitting in their home, waiting for that invitation before you can say, are we ready? Are you ready? Maybe it's the question to them, are you ready to tell me, have you trusted me? And I think be prepared for them to say no as well. And then maybe finding, but I think the beauty is, yes, we're all knowledge, you guys in this room, if you're researched and you're educated in collecting and receiving, maybe your job is to give your skill to someone who is in that community, who has the passion but might not have the know-how, and give them your skills and let them go in. So it's that culture with that, culture on culture, so they're understanding, and I think you'll get a deeper story. Doesn't mean that you can't be there to... So it's about you going out finding the right people in that community to then go to be the front runner, your white wolf, to go in and grab those stories. I think that's, that would be... I reckon that'd be ultimate, because then you're respecting their cultural practices. Don't feel that you've got no part in it, because it's vitally important. That's why I got a white male to help me with my story. I didn't need another black woman to tell me who I was as a black woman, but I needed that white man's experience in theatre, in writing for theatre. I wanted a different perspective, and because I knew that 99.9% of my paying audience would be non-Indigenous people. And at that time, what I was going through, I wanted to work with a white male. I don't know whether that's a bit of psychology in there as I think about that. Because it's, so I think that would be really awesome if you can't personally get in there, to find someone who's in there and skill them up and let them go. That would be magic. I'd give you a gold star for that, because I think that's really important. It's really important that we're allowing them to be in control of their stories.
My group facilitators are pushing you to go over time and have one more question. Is that right? Does that be a good one, please?
Hello.
Hello.
You mentioned about it's really scary about your studying, your writing, reading, everything. It seems like it's become a writer. Writing a book is a total difference against in your earlier stage. How you overcome of that? This is a big change.
How did I overcome that? Police Rescue, 96. I was never an actor that ran off to my little caravan or my green room. Because I never learned anything, I told them a little white lie that I had television experience to get on the show in the first place, and said that they had no computers in Mergen and they couldn't send my CV down. I literally said that. How crazy is that? And Anne Robinson from Liz Mulliner Casting said, "Yeah, right, Leah." I said, yeah, it's coming, but, no phones, the bush, no good up there. And because I wanted to learn on the job, I don't think I could have went to uni. I did get to grade 12, but I was one of these kids that couldn't sit still. But it was on the job training, and I would always watch and I'd ask questions. And then one day I was standing around, and there was a meeting with the writer. They happened to be present, and I'm watching everyone, and I just went, you know what? I reckon I could do this. That's exact. I remember standing there watching everyone buzz around, and it was, and I just said I can do this, but I didn't do anything until then. When I did Fallen Angels, once again we were having meetings, and then I started directing, and I told Gary McDonald to go and tell the director that I had an idea for the beginning of the script, but I wouldn't talk to him directly because I was too shy, and he was from Melbourne and he was all dressed in black and he scared me. And I was just, no, Gary, you do it. Make sure you tell him I told you that I said that. I said, don't you take credit for it. So
I don't know, call me cheeky, call me gutsy. I just thought, you know what, I could do this. And then I sat down one day and just went, I'm going to give it a go. But then I remembered back and I went, no, hang on a minute. I have been writing stories, you know, since grade 3 and winning the thing in grade 7. I said, oh, maybe this has, it's been around me, but I had to have the guts to grab it and go, I'm going to give it a go. And I've just written for Redfern Now, and we have permission for me to direct my own story. It is based on a fact that happened, and then of course we fictionalised it. No, I did. You know, the story must become more than you. You know, that's when ego steps in, when you won't let your story grow. And I pride myself in my ego stays. I don't really have one anymore. You get slammed as an actor. But, you know, it stays right away, and I love the fact that the story opens up and tells me where it wants to go. That's the magic. So I don't know, I just was a kid that went, but I've always been like that. All my life I've been thrown into the deep end, and I either sink or swim, and I'm still swimming. So I want to be thrown into the deep end more. Thank you.